Aaron's going to be talking to us about sticking together while staying apart, resilience in the time of a global pandemic. Take it away, Aaron.
All right. Everyone can hear me good? This is like the classic, I have too many moving parts, and so something usually goes wrong, but I think it's all working because I see the little green bar going up and down.
We can hear you. It's fantastic.
Oh, I'm not sharing a
You
screen,
should
though.
have permission to share your screen.
Click that button.
Fantastic.
Hey. Wonderful. All right. And, oh, now everything moved. Sorry. I should be good at this by now, but here we are. Okay, so yeah, this is the title of the talk, which we've said 2 or 3 times, and that's me in the corner, so we can go past that one. So I wanted to start with this quote from Terry Pratchett, if you're familiar. 1,000,000 to 1 chances crop up 9 times out of 10. And I think it's a good way to frame the concept of resilience, especially dealing with complex systems. Or put another way, I like to say, everything's a little bit broken all the time, but it keeps working anyway. Right? There's all sorts of stuff. I think especially in DevOps and ops especially, we're used to half of it's held together by, bubblegum and string, and 3 of those things aren't working, and they definitely should, but everyone's still able to access the services they need. So resilience is kind of the tie-in here, and this is what we're going to discuss. But resilience has the challenge of being one of those words that is both like academic, in that there is a technical and academic definition around resilience, as well as one that we just throw around and use day to day. Especially, I've heard it a ton during COVID of like personal resilience and talking about things like that, where I'm like, oh, hang on, I need a context switch because you are not talking about specifically the academic field of resilience engineering. So I need to change my vocabulary. So I want to dive into the a little bit more academic, and that divides resilience into 4 categories of rebound, robust ability, and sustained adaptability. This is what Woods wrote a whole white paper about that's linked in resources later. And rebound is about that returning to normal after something happens, right? When something happens, you get back to where you started. That's the concept of rebound. The interesting thing here is you can't really get better at rebound in the moment. Your systems can't get better at rebound in the moment. All the work to get good at that has to be done ahead of time for the incident or the surprise. Other ideas, robustness. This is another thing we think of with resilience or mean when we say the word. And this is the ability to withstand or absorb well-modeled disturbances, right? So think of like a big, strong brick wall or houses that don't get blown down. But these all deal with known knowns. So you have to kind of know what could fail and understand the failure model in order to prepare for it. Graceful extensibility, right? This is how much we can stretch and adapt as opposed to just falling over. The concept of like, if a lot of people are streaming on Netflix in the same area, maybe your quality will degrade before it just stops working for people, right? We always want to deliver something. And getting beyond that, we deal with something called sustained adaptability. And this is really where we leave the realm of something we can build and design and get into concepts of organizational structure and learning and all of that. This is really where people come in. We're talking about long-term adaptability to complex and changing environments. So one of the examples that's given with resilience, because this is kind of a lot to jump in with here, is the example of bone. And this is actually not even given an example, but as the archetype of what resilience should be. And this is by Dr. Richard Cook, and it came from Redeploy conference, Resilience Engineering Conference that happened in 2019, or last year, if you're using the common parlance. Something is continuously created and destroyed. Its reconstruction is directed by mechanical strain, right? So your bone reinforces itself naturally wherever you put the most pressure on it. And the process is directed by signals through layered networks at the cellular level, right? So it's all this signaling that happens. It doesn't go up to your brain to make conscious decisions to build more bone or make any decision-making process. It all happens low level. So this is held up, and this is tied to resilience engineering. And using bone as the archetype, this is something we've been doing for 3,500 years. And the concept of engineering that resilience is we've understood that the bone itself is naturally resilient, but we can affect the environment that it's in order to allow it to become the most resilient it can, right? So if you break a bone, it will heal on its own. But if we set it and if we hold it in just the right position, you keep weight off of it and then you work it later, we can, heal better and get back to the point where it's almost like new so on and so forth. There's another concept of resilience engineering where instead of tuning the environment for our resilient systems, you start working on what makes them resilient. So this goes into a whole other corner that I'm not going to dive into, but this is a super interesting talk and you should definitely watch it. But it's a whole talk in and of itself, and you should do that. So great. So again, we're talking about rebound, graceful extensibility, and robustness. I kind of mentioned before. These are all the things we can really build into our computer systems. The problem is we want more than that, right? If this is all we have, it doesn't work. And of course, we're not building just computer systems, but we have socio-technical systems. There's humans both on the front end and operating it. That's why they work, for that matter, right? Like all of our systems would just fall over if it weren't for humans intervening every day. And it's why we build them in the first place. I mean, software wouldn't exist for its own sake. So one of the concepts when we're dealing with socio-technical systems, Conway's law. So Conway's law states that any design system represents the organization's own communication structure. So however your organization is structured, oftentimes those are the systems we'll build. So you may have seen this image before. If you've seen a Netflix talk, this is usually the answer they give to what does the Netflix infrastructure look like, and they would just put this slide up because this is what the Netflix infrastructure looks like. So it's sort of interesting, right, to see how their systems are kind of widely distributed. They're all sort of in this flat, interconnected, interacted, loosely coupled. So sort of interesting about when you think about the Netflix culture deck, where they often talk about freedom and responsibility. Folks have a lot of autonomy to move individually and in small, loosely coupled groups that have common interests, and they can make the decisions they think are best. And obviously, I have to report about them. Maybe another structure is, and pardon sort of the shameless branding, but another communication structure, right? This might be to deliver software into production in an enterprise. It's a little bit different of how this communication structure works and how you structure that, because that organization operates a little bit differently. Here we have change controls, we have processes, we have checks and security balances, checking constantly to make sure everyone is on the right track. So I want to do a little bit of an experiment here with you. And this also gives me a moment to take a drink of water. Take a moment to imagine a major incident. And if closing your eyes helps you go back in time, maybe you don't relive too much, but just to think about the recent big incident you had, or some of the biggest incidents maybe you've been a part of. And what to think about then is who or what recognized this problem? What surfaced this as, hey, we've got a problem. This is Sev1, or hey, there's something major going. The second question is, how surprising was it? Was it something that you happened, something you expected, or something that came out of nowhere and suddenly, oh man, 5 things had to fail at once for this to happen? And then think also, just sort of keep in mind, what were the overlapping systems and networks and people involved? Probably had engineers and responders, like people who are dealing with it directly. You may have had managers who get involved, even if they're just dealing with, hey, I've got to clock overtime for these folks and deal with this. Managers are getting involved at some point. Maybe food delivery, right? That might happen if you're working long hours. Home life is probably affected, so probably anyone that you live with is feeling some effects of this incident. And executives and customers, right? All of these people were involved in this incident in some way. All of these networks overlapped and interacted. And then ultimately this got resolved. I assume you're not still in a Sev1 incident and at this meetup. If you are, great. I'm glad that you have the moment to listen to me. But ultimately think of the resolution, right? Where did that resolution come from when you fixed it? Is it something that came from the engineers and people involved, executives? Like, where did your actual answer come from? Now, I'm going to guess that this probably came from the engineers actually involved and touching it. And this gets to a concept of the sharp end and the blunt end of the systems that we work with. The sharp end here is the point that's closest to the work. So these are your practitioners. Your engineers are at the sharp end of the system. They're dealing with day-to-day operations. Where executives and folks are the blunt end. They're generally removed from the experience, often upstream decision makers. And what we find is consistently resilience is built at the sharp end. And what happens is we find that engineers at the sharp end are constantly building and destroying the systems they're working with. They have strong intersignaling between each other and closely connected, loosely connected, overlapping networks. They improve systems based on strain, right? The stuff that takes the most work done. And what it turns out is that this resilience will actually get built naturally as folks at the Sharpen are given ownership of that concept. And this isn't something that's completely new. This was actually discovered during the Woolworths experiment. So if you follow Sidney Decker or any of the folks that are like Safety 2 or like the new safety kind of ideas, they took Woolworths, which is a grocery chain in Australia, and they tried to do safety a new way. They took one group and said, you're going to do the same thing we've always done, which is like, mandates from the top down. Another group gets, we're going to erase everything and not give you any direction. And you get to be in charge of it. And another group where they gave some amount of background to these concepts and safety concepts, but ultimately put everyone there in charge of the safety that they were ultimately being subjected to, right? You're in charge of your own safety. They found those groups, by and large, improved overall, right? Once they were given that ability to have agency and improve the safety themselves, they did so naturally. Yeah, so this was interesting too. So J. Paul Reed, you probably know of, who was a resilience engineer at Netflix, gave a talk at FailoverConf earlier in 2020 and said the teams that do well dealing with impact, which are surprises or incidents, are those that have a strong common ground. Great, so this makes a lot of sense to me, but if we flip that around and we want to work on our teams and say, how do I improve my team's resilience? Well, we should build a common ground, right? This makes sense to me. We want to work on that. So what do we mean when we say common ground, and how do we work on that? Well, people that are working together, the common ground builds a basic compact, right? This is I'm available and how you interact and that sort of thing. Your goal, and you have alignment of commitment, right? You're all committed to a goal and it's going the same direction. Inter-Predictability, this is how you interact with each other. Right? So when you go to Starbucks, there's a certain way it's supposed to go. Hi, I'd like to order this. Sure, what's your name? It'll be this much. And you hand them money and then you get coffee eventually. If you asked for a coffee and they screamed in your face, threw their smock at you, jumped up on the counter and ran off, like that would be low inter-predictability, right? Like you did not expect that reaction in this transaction. And these, again, common ground will sustain and repair itself. That's something that it wants to do once we put people in charge of these things. So if we're going to build it, these are the kinds of things that work on that, right? It's a lot of doing things like the blameless postmortems, or I would say even getting beyond blameless postmortems, which is a whole conversation I can have when we get to Q&A. But yeah, those types of concepts, doing things like chaos engineering, right? Understanding where our systems stretch and doing those things together, game days, and modeling vulnerability, especially from leadership. All of these things help us build the connection with our team and help us understand and become more resilient. And you'll notice a lot of this is building towards that psychological safety, right? That thing that we've found studying teams, ultimately that is what the number one predictor of a high operating team is that psychological safety on the team. And this isn't just like one study, this is from Accelerate in 2019 as well, found that not only is that like predictive of a good time, but it will give you measurable results. These teams with high psychological safety showed measurable improvement in software delivery, organizational performance, and productivity. So here's, I happen to be giving this talk the first time at Deserted Island DevOps, which is coming up again this year, but that's a different, I'll plug that later. But this talk that Maddie Stratton did, Kicking or Keeping, collaborating on our own deserted islands, turned out to be amazing for talking about psychological safety. It's actually a perfect psychological safety. If you want to dive deeper into that and how to really work on that for your teams, this is a great talk, and starting with that one. This was a line from Ryan Henricks at the Greater Than Code podcast, saying resilience is all about creating conditions that maximize everyone's potential. And I absolutely agree with that. And this is why that psychological safety does so well to building that in your teams, right? And this is a great episode of this podcast as well. I've got a bunch of resources on the speaking page, so you don't have to worry about trying to write these down as we go through. Great. So all of this sort of led me to building this sort of model and concept that resilience worked, was held by larger systems, right? You have these smaller networks that work up to bigger networks as things fail was sort of my first idea, right? You might have some self-healing that you get built in, and if that doesn't work, it alerts somebody, and if they can't fix it, they get a larger team, then maybe your organization has to get involved. And then sort of 2020 happened, and we got to see this modeled in reverse, right? What happens when the big systems fall apart? That doesn't fit that model at all. Or more importantly, what happens when governments fail, right? Like if we lose these outer layers, what's left? So this resilience is all about community building. All the work that we do here to build communities is building resilience in those communities, right? And if we look at strong communities, what do they have? They're usually diverse. They've got a lot of different people with different signals coming in, adding overlapping networks. There's high trust and safety. They sustain and repair itself, right? It always wants to turn back into community. It doesn't want to fall apart. High inter-predictability, you know each other, like in a really strong relationship. Think about that. You can have whole conversations without talking about the subject. Oh yeah, totally. I'll get it to you next week. All right, no problem. Like no one outside that conversation understands what happened or could understand what occurred. That goes up. And of course, they're all loosely coupled layer networks. Our strongest communities aren't islands in and of themselves, but they're connected to all of these different groups and different communities that can help sustain it. So it's interesting as we sort of saw this as COVID went on. One of the early things that happened near me, this is actually my school district, is they just started free meals for anyone who was under 18 in the school district. You didn't have to even be going to the schools. You get breakfast and lunch. They're just going to hand them out. They're going to do them on the bus route or come pick them up. They just had the resources and they were able to get the food at that scale, and they knew they could provide for the community because they know how many people in our area actually rely on free and reduced lunch. It's over half the school populations. This was sort of interesting, right? These stores started offering separate shopping times for older and vulnerable customers. And this wasn't something that happened through government mandate. These places weren't told, hey, you have to offer this. They just opted to do this. And maybe it was it was good for business, but they still chose to do that in order to create that resource for that group. This was great, right? We had mask shortages, and across states, people started sewing them. They started providing them from healthcare workers because they could. They had the time and they had the material. And another version of community, rent strikes started getting planned. As folks were unable to pay for their rents for the first or second time, you would find other members of that same building looking to stand up for that community, right? Trying to make sure they continue to have a house. This was actually really interesting as well. So obviously, 2020 kept going since I first delivered this talk. And there were a lot of protests in Portland. There's a group stands for something. And if I was not a fraud, I would be able to tell you exactly what it was, but I completely forgot because Ewoks is just such a great name on its own. But they're a mutual aid group in Portland, and they were first mobilized for protests offering water and aid. And when the wildfires happened, they immediately relocated out towards where they could best serve those communities running away and needing support from the wildfires, offering their services there. This was the whole Boston community trying to help folks out who were seeing evictions starting to come through when no one had seen any relief or money. And the whole community stood up and even blocked the courthouse so that the things couldn't be, evictions couldn't be filed, right? Because the whole community was standing and preventing that from occurring. So there's a lot more that can go into this. This is a fantastic podcast. This was from the Worst Year Ever podcast, which was the worst, best name ever. And this was a great episode that talks a lot about how to build that type of mutual aid and how to work with your communities and do that sort of thing. Highly recommend it. There's lots of other episodes that are good there too. There's some that talk about the concepts of like prepping and how you can do that ethically and how that can support your community, right? The idea should be once you can build up enough, you should be able to provide for other people, for other folks that don't have what they need. You should have those stores. And that's kind of the idea behind it. Okay, so all of that is good. And want to dive a little bit further because as I was also thinking about all this, a lot of this year has been tough, I think, for a lot of people individually, not just in groups. And our communities have been divided and pushed remote and haven't seen each other. And as I was struggling one of these days, I was on Twitter, for better or for worse, but for better in this case, but sometimes the first thing we have to do is take care of our communities. To take care of our communities is take care of ourselves. Be gentle with yourselves. You should follow Katie, by the way, because she will always send you exactly what you need to hear the moment you need to hear it. So it is probably one of the better follows on Twitter. And I needed this in the moment, which was great, right? We can't serve our communities if we're not able to function, or if we're suffering because of that. Or put another way, you can't pour from an empty cup. Another one of my favorite people on Twitter. And yeah, and it's hard to fill the cup if it's cracked and leaking, right? There's so many things we don't think about, and it's so easy to dive into work or working on other people that we start losing focus on our ability to provide that. Back to that same talk from J. Paul Reed, actually, he has a section where he talks about coping with cognitive load. And these are the different ways that when we're at capacity, when we're like always, we've got too much, we're either gonna have to get rid of stuff, shed the load, trade off thoroughness, right? You're not going to be as complete. You're not going to dig in, check all the details. Yeah, good enough, get it out the door, ship it. You might shift work in time, right? So you'll do things later, things earlier, move things around. And the last one is recruit more resources. So you pull in, if you were at a business, for instance, you might pull in people from another team in order to try and get that done. Or you might ask for help and have someone else help. And this was talked about in the context of teams and how the first two are more tactical, the last two are more strategic, so they involve different people. But the comment that really stood out to me in this whole conversation was that Paul kind of casually tossed out when he talked about thoroughness, we're all probably trading off thoroughness right now in our daily lives. And that sort of hit me, because if we're all trading off thoroughness right now during the pandemic, that means all of us are operating at maximum all the time, which is not great. It's something to be aware of. And so that got me thinking a lot about the other methods we deal with that. So I wrote a whole blog post basically about that. Like, how do we deal with the fact that even in our workday, we're so at capacity that we're often, we have to make these choices of what we do. And normally we would have to involve folks if we're going to shift work in time, or if we're going to recruit more resources. One of the things we can start doing is we can start pulling resources from ourselves, because we sort of mashed our work and life into this one workhouse life that we have now. So the things I'll find myself doing is, I can get that done. I'll do it after dinner. I'll do it this other time. Or I will very easily pull time from my evening where normally I'd be home and separate from my work and not able to do that. And I start borrowing my own time, right? And then I don't get that back. So any of the time I needed for self-care is now sacrificed to work, right? So this is just something I was thinking about, of us all needing to think about it, whether we are individual contributors, of understanding what our limits are, or whether you're in charge of teams, right? Having an eye out for what your team is dealing with. So there's lots of ways we can start helping ourselves too. Some of it is just to have fun. I loved this moment, which happened after a conference online. And these folks that are not me in this picture, all are organizers of DevOps Days Portland, and happen to be wearing the same shirt and like North Face fleece or hoodie or whatever. It was just a very funny moment as everyone took pictures of each other and showed up in each other's background, which is just like ways to feel a little bit more connected. Had some moments during the pandemic as well of just hanging out with friends in Animal Crossing, right? This was actually me and Matt Stratton early on, just hanging out in each other's islands, which are apart, but for some reason having this like tangible shared space felt like that little bit more of a connection, right? Doing those things together and impacting things together feels a little bit more of a close connection. I recommend digital karaoke. If you're not a karaoke fan, I still recommend it. But if you are a karaoke fan, you definitely need to do it. Get a Zoom call together, and you get YouTube, and you just sort of share screens and play and sing and have a great time. Definitely do this, and it's a blast. Awesome conferences. So Deserted Island DevOps, what I loved about this was just, it had the right combination of wholesome whimsy and like the serious conversations that we needed to have about DevOps and about communities and about being good to each other during global pandemic. It's coming up for the second one, which is unfortunately still during our pandemic next month. So check out desertedislanddevops.com for the historic and upcoming conference that's happening there. And as you're checking those, just to throw more of this out, because again, this first conference just came together and these talks just meshed so well. Katie Farmer, yet again, you've got a friend in me, is such a wonderful, wholesome way to have wrapped that that conference, and you should watch that talk anytime, but especially if you're feeling down and out about everything going on. So to leave you with this, what do we want to think about with resilience? The whole goal here is to enable the potential, enable the resilience that's already there, and get out of the way. Let folks do what they will naturally do. So thanks for listening to me. I'm Aaron Aldrich. I forgot to change my title. I'm not a cloud adoption specialist. I'm a managed OpenShift black belt. You can find these slides, at least from a previous talk. I'll upload it all once I get the video and resources and stuff. It just takes me a minute to get all the slides uploaded, and they'll be there. Other things I do, check out them. They do open sourcing mental illness. Even if that doesn't resonate with you, they do a big survey every year. There's like a data section. They want to survey as many people in tech as we can about mental health, just to try and get a feel of what's going on with folks. So please do that survey if you get a chance. Anyway, check out all these things. They're all good. DevOpsDays.org. Shameless plug. I do tabletop DevOps every month on Twitch, where a bunch of DevOps friends get together and play board games. It's a good fun. And to leave you with that, I love you all. Do good out there. We're all in this together.
Thank you, Aaron. That was really good. So I don't see any questions yet in the chat, but there was one comment. The EWOX stands for Equitable Workers Offering Community with a K support. And that was from
Perfect.
Austin.
I love that they did it to make it fit the acronym.
I'm pretty sure that was a backronym, or they came up with the acronym and then find something to fit.
Yeah. No, it's
and-
perfect. Thank you for finding that, Austin.
And then while I wait to see if anybody else has any questions, how do you become a black belt? 'Cause you're the second. We have
Rigorous qualifications, and the team decides that's what the name's going to be. Largely, it's what it is. It's actually we're modeling it off of Microsoft has a similar like global black belt team. We're sort of a technical sales-ish focused group, but we're it's a lot of like what developer advocates do, but I'm focused directly on like strategic accounts as opposed to strategic communities. They're communities, they just all happen to work at the same place. Because you'll find, enterprise accounts with 5,000 engineers, right? Like I've got a 5,000 engineer group of people I need to go talk to and influence about I'm on board with cloud native app things.
Yeah, some companies are much larger than communities will be.
Right. So it's actually really interesting because it's like jumping into these very corporate communities which have these very strict rules, and everyone's together like 8 hours a day every weekday. So it's a very very different type of community hopping than like going to different meetups or conferences or things like that.
All right, I don't see anybody else has jumped in